Thank you for that. Building resilience in a changing world. I congratulate you on a very apposite title. Wherever we look as business leaders of today, we're beset by changes and trends, technological, market, environmental, social, uncertainty. And the chairman couldn't have set us up better for this presentation in his opening remarks this morning. How we square the circle between those seemingly competing demands, I couldn't agree more strongly, should not be a zero-sum game. But when it comes to the environment, in many walks of life, too often, it's seen as just that. The perception is often that the costs outweigh the benefits. We've got a story for you today about a bit of innovation that's been spawned out of the YTL group, which demonstrates how we can embrace the digital age, new technologies, to create not only more resilient businesses, but a more resilient environment. That concept of resilience runs deep. We've already heard how it extends to our characters in leadership, and it extends beyond the resilience of our businesses and supply chains to the environment and social assets around us that sustain us and feed our business cultures. So we've got a story for you today about a bit of innovation. It's about future-proofing the environment as much as about future-proofing our businesses. And it's about turning on its head that perception that the costs of investing in our environment outweigh the benefits. It's about avoided costs and creating a business opportunity out of that model. And fundamentally, at the heart of our story, is the premise that you can create value by thinking differently, by rethinking your business model and adapting your business model. You can create value and overcome the changes and trends that we are challenged by in this uncertain world. Now, like the previous speaker, I'm a great disciple and fan of Simon Sinek. We saw him strutting his stuff as we came into the room first thing this morning. We start, I believe, fundamentally as leaders and in successful organizations with a clear sense of guiding purpose that need to be aligned with our values as our leaders. So I'll make no apology for wearing on my own sleeve my passions that have guided me in my career to date in the environment and politics. And I've dedicated my career to this point in influencing governments and businesses that the environment should be put at the heart of our decision making. I look to others for inspiration in that philosophy. And when I look to the public realm, I'd look no further than His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. This quote, if there was such a thing as a business case for the environment, this quote from His Royal Highness, I think, pretty aptly sums up what that would look like. He talks about rewiring our economy. He talks about tilting policy and finance in favor of more sustainable, low-carbon business models. And he's a brilliant ambassador and a visible champion of thinking differently in that regard, often perceived to be maverick. But he's relentless in pointing out that the environment is all too often forgotten, and that it will ultimately be all of us that will suffer the consequences if we don't address that. If we look to our mainstream politicians for guidance and leadership, this gentleman is David Cameron, who you'll all remember, I'm sure, as the UK Prime Minister. Here he is before his election as Prime Minister in his husky-hugging days, prior to the point when he became effectively the architect of Brexit. Now, David Cameron, back in 2006, made a big play in his mission to detoxify the brand of his party for putting the environment at the heart of his list of priorities. And in the week that he was elected the leader of the opposition, I was invited alongside a number of other environmental leaders to meet Mr. Cameron and go and talk to him about his commitment. And he listened earnestly while we sat and pitched our various ideas for policy commitments that he might incorporate into his manifesto for government. And later that day, he stood in front of the TV cameras and made a pledge that if you voted Conservative, vote blue, you'd be going green. 4 years, fast forward 4 years, 2010, Mr. Cameron enters Downing Street as Prime Minister of the first coalition government in the UK for 3 decades. We've experienced a global recession. There's a squeeze on incomes and wage growth in the UK, and that the overriding focus of his government is necessarily on squeezing the public deficit. His commitment and conviction to the environment is quietly discarded and sidelined. Unless you think I'm making a party political point here, I'll pray and aid Tony Blair, the chairman's friend. I'm a great fan. I met him a number of times when he was Prime Minister, particularly in the run-up to the G8 summit that he hosted back in 2005, when he was absolutely messianic about putting climate change on the global stage. He took on one of my ideas, which was about embedding renewable energy in the Building for Schools programme in the UK. But when it came to some of the more hard choices pitched by more radical voices around me, he wasn't interested. Tony Blair was very clear. He saw the environmental cause as anti-business, anti-aspirational. He associated with lobby groups and voices championing regulation, championing negative approaches. It was about stopping things, not about growing things and a positive agenda. And you can't blame politicians, mainstream politicians, for shirking the opportunity to make that business case for the environment, to demonstrate that political leadership in the face of the absence of a short-term electoral mandate. So the political case, the business case, is hard to make, and yet the case for action, the chairman made it eloquently himself this morning. He chose air pollution and traffic. I've chosen plastics. You could choose any number of illustrations of the problems that we face in this regard. There are 1.8 trillion items of plastic bobbing around in one patch in the center of the Pacific Ocean. And it's a really compelling illustration of why top-down environmental regulation will not solve the complex environmental challenges we face today, that are driven effectively by decisions taken on a day-to-day basis by you and me. And I go back to that notion of resilience. This is a challenge for businesses in the sense that unless we tackle these issues through the business models that we adopt and innovate, the very resilience of our supply chains and markets will be affected by the consequences of these types of environmental pollution and climate change. Why are we in this position? If there was such a thing as a business model for the environment, we would say it was broken, wouldn't we? And I would contend it's because we can't think about these things in we think about these things in a fragmented way. It's almost like we have two sides of our brain. You know, the moral side of our brain recognizes the moral case, recognizes the intrinsic value of the natural world to our well-being, the reverence and the sense of peace we experience in beautiful places. And yet the rational side of us says it can be dealt with by somebody else. It's something for government to pick up. And those two sides of our brain are expressed in two schools of thought. Economists, conventional economists would say environmental problems are a market failure. They're an externality, as it's described in economist jargon, to be dealt with through state intervention, subsidy, and regulation. And environmentalists, on the other hand, would say it would be morally wrong to place a value on nature. It would lead to the thoughtless commodification. It could only lead to the destruction of our natural assets. And those two schools of thought fundamentally miss the point that our quality of life and our economies are fundamentally dependent on our natural assets and natural world. So to come to the point, that's why we're so excited about Entrade. Entrade has embraced digital technologies to come up with a solution to these problems. It's about incentivizing people to deal with the causes of environmental pollution rather than dealing with the downstream costs and consequences. Now, the last bit of analysis I'm going to describe to you before I hand to Laura is the bit of analysis that actually stimulated the concept of an eBay for the environment in the first place. There's no shortage of funding back in the UK going into addressing our environmental problems at home. £13 billion, we've estimated, of funding flows into environmental services across England annually, administered by up to 50 different organisations in a patch. And that complexity and that fragmentation is further exacerbated by complex government regulation and complex and over-bureaucratic government schemes. It's a muddle. It's crying out for finance, for private sector finance and capability. And what we've done in creating Entrade has provided a mechanism to enable that to happen. It's a bit of innovation incubated by the Wessex Water Group and supported by the Offshore Development Centre here in Kuala Lumpur. And here to tell us about how we took it from an idea to proof of concept, I'm going to hand over to Laura.
Great. Thank you so much, Guy. It is hugely exciting to be here today to talk about Entrade. It is and still will always be my baby, but it's great to hand it over to Guy to see it grow. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to take you through the journey that we went on to try and transform what Guy articulated as a really complicated and costly administrative system that didn't really place a value on the environment. How could I take the statement that my boss posed to me 3.5 years ago or so? Can you build me an eBay for the environment? How more cryptic could you get? But we wanted to see if we could revolutionize how this 13 billion was funded. So if we can, I'm going to take a step back and give you a bit of the context of why Wessex Water was interested in creating such an eBay platform. So if we can play the first clip, let's hope technology works for me. Yes, fantastic. So the footage you're seeing here is Dorset, the typical English countryside. Amazing rolling hills, meandering rivers, and picture-perfect villages. If you've read Thomas Hardy, this is where he sets his books. It is the green and pleasant land of England. But farming is at its centre, and land has been handed down from generation to generation. But unfortunately, this beautiful countryside is facing environmental threat. Farming creates nutrients, and these nutrients enter the watercourse and form these algal mats on the form of the harbour down in Poole. Now, these mats are caused by nutrients, nitrogen in the watercourse that allows algae to bloom and thrive. And once these mats have formed around the edge, the protected species in that harbour, which was once this beautiful blue lagoon, there we go, it's facing environmental decline. It is no longer once the pristine environment that it was. So why should Wessex Water be involved in this? What was our responsibility? We've got several sewage works in the catchment that feed Poole Harbour, and we are one of those sources of nitrogen, but we're 12% of it. And our environmental regulators said to us, we want you to save 40 tonnes of nitrogen in that harbour. We need you to stop it from entering it. And we could have done so, definitely. We could have spent £6 million to build a concrete and metal solution to remove that nitrogen. It would have cost us £50 per kilogram of nitrogen as a whole life cost. And yes, we could do. The water industry is seen as a bit of a cash cow in the environmental industry. We've got money. We are a third of that £13 billion to be spent. But we're only 12% of the contribution in this catchment. Could we address the bigger cause, as Guy mentioned? Could we look at the fundamental source, which was farming? If we can play the second clip, just so you can get an idea of farming in the UK. I'll carry on talking when it starts. Brilliant. So farmers in the UK have a complex environmental scheme at the moment that is designed to encourage basic environmental standards, but is hugely costly to administer and incredibly complicated for farmers to engage with. We had our own 40-tonne target. Could we see if we could transform this scheme using digital technologies, test it in our local Poole Harbour catchment, and then scale it up to show that we could use that £13 billion in a better way? If we work with farmers to offset nutrients, instead of the £50 per kilogram that it would cost us, farming can do it somewhere between about 0 and 10 pounds per kilogram of nitrogen. That is an incredible saving. Why go after Wessex Water's 12% when farmers are 66%? So I'm going to give you a very quick crash course in farming, just so you've got an idea of what we were doing. So the picture you can see here, this shows a field. And what we asked farmers to do was, after the commercial crop was harvested in August, we asked them to plant a cover crop. So instead of the field being left bare over the winter, as you can see in the middle here, the crop that they planted formed a cover. It took up the nutrients that were left in the soil from when they'd applied fertilizer over the summer. It locked up that nitrogen, and it meant that when it rained over the winter, it didn't get washed away. It didn't enter the watercourse. Great for Wessex, that solved our nitrogen problem. But actually, the cover crop has far more environmental benefits. It's biodiverse. It creates an environment where animals can live over that horrible winter period. It stops floodwaters. The crops slow the flow of water and means they don't reach the river as quickly. It's a carbon source. It's green. That means it's used carbon to grow. And for farmers, it increases the quality of their soil and stops it eroding with the rain. It increases their productivity. Could we demonstrate that via Entrade, if Wessex Water bought nitrates, were there other people who might be willing to buy some of these other benefits? Could we create that business case and articulate the value of an environmental offset? Could we bring other people along to try and buy these services from us? So there were 250 farmers in Poole Harbour. Could we start to create a trading platform that brought them all together? So I'm going to move back into the depths of Entrade now and give you an idea of the journey that we went through. When I can get the clicker working. Fantastic. So the stages that we went through were exploring and designing similar markets. Could we learn from what was already out there? Was there anything out there? Engaging with our customers and making sure we were building something that people would use. The exciting part where you build the platform and really see your vision come to life. Launching it, and that heart-stopping moment where you press live and you hope that it works and you hope that people bid. And the review process, which people often find not the fun part of it, but making sure that you've learned from what you've built and you can continue to grow. So exploring and designing. For this stage, I worked with a lady from Exchanging Malaysia who came over to Bath for a month, and we started by looking at similar markets. Now, we've heard a lot today from the chairman already about the carbon market. And in theory, that sounds like a really similar environmental market. Most times when you get on a plane, you're asked, would you like to plant a tree to offset the impact you're having? But actually, carbon is a really different environmental market. The tree that we might plant here in England, the carbon that it saves has a global impact. It doesn't matter where you start saving that carbon. But for nitrogen, it's an incredibly local impact. You must save the nitrogen in the catchment where you're seeing the environmental impact. So similar to carbon, but very different, but a useful relationship for us to look at. We then needed to look at the buyers and sellers. Wessex Water were obviously a buyer. We needed 40 tons of nitrogen. But if we wanted to scale up beyond this local trial and move into that £13 billion, could we see a way where other people might want to buy more environmental offsets? And we've talked about farmers. There are 140,000 farmers in the UK. They are definitely one source of an environmental seller, but might there be more in the future? And then crucially, the role of Entrade. How could we create this market and harness digital technology to bring these buyers and sellers together? Actually, did I just need to create an eBay auction? Was that the solution? Was it just a man with a clipboard or a woman with a clipboard to go and talk to each individual farmer? Or was there a way that we could use digital technology without forgetting that person at the end of the phone who talks to customers to bring them together and to create that environmental marketplace? Could we bring people onto that one platform and identify the value of the environment? And as I'm sure YTL will be pleased to hear, we also realized that long-term, we needed to make sure there was a revenue stream from this. We were doing the right thing here, protecting the environment, but long-term, could we see a way that other people would use Entrade? Could we see how we could return on our investment? And so that took time. And yes, it's torturous when you think you know what you want to build, but actually you need to make that investment and check your assumptions are correct. And then we got on to the next part. If we can play the third video, that would be great. So the video you're about to see shows two of my core customers of Entrade. Adrian works for Wessex Water on the left-hand side, and Howard is a farmer in Poole Harbour on the right. Now, Howard is your traditional Dorset farmer, a little bit gruff, possibly unfriendly when you first meet him, but actually incredibly passionate about farming. He loves what he does, and he has had this farm in his family for generations. He was going to be my end user of Entrade, and his experience of farming schemes to date was mixed. If he couldn't use Entrade on his sofa, watching TV in the evening, if it wasn't simple to use and easy, he wasn't interested. And if I couldn't get farmers to use Entrade, I didn't have my market. And then we had Adrian. So Adrian was probably my toughest nut to crack, but is now my biggest supporter of Entrade. He'd spent a year in Poole Harbour talking to some of these 250 farmers about how they could help us. And he was worried that a digital technology was going to replace his efforts and damage that relationship. He needed to know that this platform would build on what he'd created. And so I spent many hundreds of hours down in the Dorset catchment with Adrian and his team. We had whiteboard upon whiteboard of possible problems and issues that farmers could face. Some of them were likely. Some of them were a bit more obscure and probably not going to happen. But that investment in knowing your customer and understanding their fears is crucial. It means that you know that what you're going to build will work for them. And Adrian's mantra of keep it simple and straightforward is the underlying ethos still of Entrade today. It must be easy to use. And I love this part of the journey. Talking to your customers and finding out what they want is amazing. Now, we had other regulators as well that we had to keep on board. If we wanted to be able to get access to that 13 billion that Guy talked about, regulators such as Natural England, who Guy did used to work for, and the Environment Agency needed to be on board with what we were doing. A new digital technology was a very scary concept for them. They were used to regulating our metal and concrete assets. How would they react to our digital online world? But after this time, we designed what we needed to. We'd worked out what we wanted to build. And then we had to move on to the exciting part. Could we actually create this platform? But we had a problem. As much as I would want it to, the farming calendar and the weather will not change for me. It's just not going to happen. We were at the end of February, and we realized we had to have this platform up and running on the 1st of August so that farmers could bid. And whilst that sounds like a huge amount of time, actually Entrade existed in my head and on a few whiteboards down in Dorset. So we had to go through a really quick process of building our Entrade Bible. 150 pages of documentation later, with detailed process flows, matrices, goodness knows what else, we had that coding for the developer. And then we took agile working to the extreme. To keep costs down, as this was a proof of concept, I had one developer from Exchanging Malaysia who was working in India. He was both my developer and tester, and every 2 days he'd send me over a new bit of the platform. I'd test it and feedback. We had midnight phone calls to try and work out the bugs that were there. And in the week before go live, I was on holiday in Italy. My husband was asleep in the hotel room, sorry. I was in the corridor. And I was Skyping the lad at midnight. We had some bugs. We had to make sure that this worked. We had one shot with farmers, and if it didn't work, they would not come back. But after all those midnight phone calls, after those heart-stopping moments of thinking, is this going to happen? Can we get this live? We did. And so if the sound guys, again, can play the next video clip. This is Entrade. You will see it is simple and easy to use. Drop-down menus and clear user interfaces. And pressing go live on that first auction on the 1st of June was terrifying. What if I'd missed a bug? What if it didn't work? What if the farmers didn't want to come and place a bid? We'd been talking to them about it. We'd sent them leaflets, but it didn't mean they'd come and use it. This was a huge change from what they were used to. And for the first 17 days of our 21-day auction, actually, I was worried. We received a very small handful of bids. What if the investment that we'd made didn't work? But luckily, this was where Adrian and our relationship that we built up came into its own. Adrian knew his farmers. He knew that farmers, like most of us, are very lastminute.com. Why bother doing today what you could do tomorrow? And actually, they still had 4 days left of this auction. That was loads of time. And luckily for me, at least, because I'm still standing here today, those farmers did place the bids. And by the end of the auction, we received bids for more than twice our auction target. And as those bids came in and the farmers saw their supply, outstrip our demand, that price dropped. And by the end of the auction, we were paying £1.14 per kilogram of nitrogen. Now, if you compare that to the £50 we would have paid for an asset solution, that is a huge difference. And so luckily for me, that auction worked. And it's meant that we've gone on to run more auctions. There we go. Since that first auction in June 2016, we've run a further 13 schemes, not only for Wessex Water, but also for United Utilities, a Northern Water company, and Natural England, who wanted to try out this new technology. We've received £350,000 worth, or about 2 million ringgits, of bids. That is huge. And 200 tonnes of nitrogen have been prevented from entering water sources. Crucially, for Wessex Water, we still don't need to build that asset. We are still avoiding that £6 million capital spend on the treatment plant. And we are seeing a 30% reduction in the operational cost. There is a government scheme that I mentioned that tries to encourage basic farming practices. They pay 30% more than Entrade, but farmers are willing to come to us because we've made that scheme simple. We have made it easy for them to engage with, so they are willing to receive less money. Now, I mentioned the review process, and it almost feels like an afterthought because this has been exciting. But we've need to make sure that we continue to build on the success. And so we ran drop-in workshops with farmers. They are very, very willing, as you might be able to imagine, to give their opinion, and they definitely received, for me, a huge number of opinions on Entrade. We ran pie and pint evenings in local pubs and bacon sandwich breakfast to get them out and telling us what they thought. And it was mixed. We've got a red and a green traffic light here. The red one, they needed more information. If you've ever been onto eBay and placed a bid, you know at that point in time if you're that top bidder. They didn't get that in the first version of Entrade. So the red-green bar that you might recall from the video, that was added because of our farmers' feedback. The amber, they couldn't quite work out why they were bidding, so we realized we needed to improve our messaging. And maybe that would mean in future auctions, for the first 17 days, I wouldn't be sat there desperately hoping that someone would come along and place that bid. But my green feedback, and perhaps the oddest compliment that I've received for Entrade, is that it wasn't as hard as I thought. So this was said by a farmer who, when I met him prior to the Entrade launch, told me that he didn't do technology and that he would get his daughter to place the bids on Entrade because it just wouldn't work. Actually, when I met him on his farm after the auction, he told me that he had sat there on his sofa in front of Coronation Street, a British soap, for those of you who don't know, and had placed his bids on Entrade. And he'd been back in and revised his bids. So for a farmer to tell us that it wasn't as hard as he thought, that was an incredible win for Entrade. And so I've told you how fab I think Entrade is. Hopefully it's come across that I love it. But actually, people in the UK also agree. DEFRA, in the bottom left there, are the parent company and organisation of Natural England and the Environment Agency. And they have put Entrade in the 25-year plan for the environment as an example of how we can reform these environmental markets and use digital technology to improve the way that we value our environmental offsets. So for me, this is the end of the beginning for Entrade. I'm handing over to Guy to take this product and grow it. But it's very much the future, and Guy is going to take you through that now.
Okay, thank you. You guys have earned your coffee break, but I will just very briefly reflect on where we take Entrade from here. Laura's described the R&D stage, and my job now as MD is to come in and bring it to a business startup. Just reflecting, I guess, on the lessons that we have learned until this point, though, in creating a digital offering, it's not an easy gig, as Laura's described. That was an incredibly hard journey that she described there for you. We will reflect on the fact that you'll inevitably come up against resistance from incumbents, be they regulators or entrenched business interests. There's an issue about how you create a business opportunity in the absence of a robust market, which is where we're at the moment with environmental trading. And you need agility and rapid decision making. So that's what's brought us to this point with Entrade. What we see as groundbreaking, and it informs where we want to take the vision, is that we've taken some complex environmental challenges, and through the proprietary technology we've developed in Entrade, it spits out simple business choices for the guys that actually could deliver the solutions to the cause. And fundamentally, it has created, as Laura's described, a market price for an environmental outcome. We see that as really groundbreaking. And it's that concept of an online marketplace that can bring together the buyers and sellers of environmental outcomes, breaking down those inefficiencies and silos that I described as in my introduction, that we see as the compelling value proposition for Entrade as a business in its own right. So to give you a sense of where we'll develop the product from here, the horizontal axis is describing the markets that we think we can expand and develop into, and the vertical axis is the way in which we develop the proprietary technology. We see in the short term the markets around water quality and biodiversity, that's birds, habitats for birds and wildlife as being the entry points for Entrade. And we want to develop in particular our IP around the nexus between big data and remote sensing, to enable us to verify really cost-effectively and simply the outcomes that are being delivered through our schemes. That's quite a significant breakthrough if we can get that, because the traditional approach is very much heavily predicated on the man from the ministry going up the farm drive with his clipboard. We can outperform that. We have a revenue model. It's about taking a brokerage fee from the transactions that will flow through the system. And we know, based on the proof of concept, that we can outperform traditional approaches by 30% in our trading schemes. So we can hand back to our customer efficiencies and savings as part of that blend. We also know that the water industry in the UK will see an environmental investment programme of £5 billion between 2020 and 2025. There are some big numbers for us to go at there to create a sustainable and growing business. But the real prize will be ultimately moving into those other markets and exposing through the platform the opportunities and cost for other investors, other business sectors to crowd in and drive down the price of these environmental outcomes and the solutions to these problems. You saw on the video there that Laura showed you how the product currently looks. This is an impression of what we see the front end as looking like. Now, efficient markets are driven by information, and so we see Entrade becoming a free-for-use service for the users of Entrade to attract farmers to peer-to-peer advice through online exchanges and fora, and through the use of real-time information, nudges, and notification to nudge them into doing the right thing for the environment too. So all of that will build into the product and the brand that sense of enduring community that we hope will sustain us and attract additional customers. To give you 3 really quick practical examples of how we see this working in practice, so 3 hot prospects. This is another catchment in the Wessex water region, also beset by problems with nutrient enrichment. It's also a very desirable place to live, and a region where we're seeking to meet some challenging and stretching housing targets. The local planning authority takes the view that more homes means more nutrient enrichment. And at the moment, it's taking a very easy solution to that, which is to refuse planning applications. We can see an opportunity to work with developers to create a model which will overcome those issues, give developers a clean break from the planning system and business certainty, and building on the willing group of farmers we have in that patch to provide the solutions to the environmental problems through offsets. We touched earlier on the carbon market as a more mature environmental market. We're working with Heathrow Airport, who see a business opportunity in the face of a global aviation carbon regime that will scale from 2021 to invest in a domestic market for carbon offsets. In particular, they see the opportunity to invest in managing and restoring cherished UK landscapes like the Northern Uplands in the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District as the very assets to which many of our tourists are attracted in the UK. And they want to work with Entrade to provide a solution at scale through environmental trading. And lastly, the National Trust. It's a very much-loved, iconic institution in the UK. 123 years old, 4.5 million members. We're working, and they love Entrade. They love Entrade. So we're working with the National Trust in partnership to explore how we can help them solve the problem of delivering permanent net environmental gain in conjunction with their assets and their properties by providing auctions for farmers along the river corridors close to their properties. Okay, so this was just a gratuitous excuse to put this photo up of me talking to the Prince of Wales. I referenced him earlier as an ambassador of the business case for the environment. But it just brings to life, I think, how Entrade is perceived. So this was an occasion which I was invited to, alongside a number of other senior leaders across the UK water industry, to meet the Prince, to talk to him and address his challenge that the water industry could be doing more for the environment. It was a quintessentially English occasion, a cream tea reception in Moreton-on-the-Marsh. And I was introduced to him to explain to him my vision for Entrade. Wonderful opportunity to practice my elevator pitch. We have an online marketplace, Your Royal Highness, which will create new markets for farmers in environmental services post-Brexit. The lights came on in his eyes. He got it? Really? He wanted to hear more. And he got it immediately. He's very passionate about creating resilience for farming sectors in the margins of our society, likely to be vulnerable as we wean the industry off state subsidies post-Brexit. And he got it. His parting question to me, or his parting shot to me, I hope you've got a big team. I told him I've got a glint in my eye. So to conclude, we are excited about Entrade. You can see Prince of Wales is excited about Entrade. We've barely touched the surface of the opportunities to open markets in environmental trading. We know there's interest internationally, but we've barely explored those opportunities beyond the UK. So I'd be delighted to hear from any of you in this room today if you have ideas and opportunities for how we might pilot and scale Entrade based on the proprietary technology. The ingredients are pretty simple. We need a willing buyer with cash and a problem to solve. We need a willing source of suppliers of environmental services and a clear environmental goal and target. With those vectors in place, Entrade can effectively do the rest. Please do come and see us if you have ideas or thoughts on how we could help you address those problems. But to conclude, the quote I've put up here, I think, quite ably illustrates the challenge that we face in the face of these disruptive emerging digital technologies. We like to think that Entrade shines a light on how we can embrace those technologies to produce not only a business opportunity, but also create a solution to our environmental problems. And I hope in doing so, it also gives some clues as to how we can get that optimal blend of the means of connection alongside the assets and the means of production that have formed the basis of so many thriving business models in this room today. And by doing so, coming back to my opening premise, it's by thinking differently about our business models that we will adapt and grow our businesses in the face of these technologies. Thank you.